7th grade. This lesson that I will be presenting today is your Wednesday lesson for this week and your Thursday lesson. My video will be a little bit longer. There's a few read alouds that go with it, and then you'll be doing some work yourself with it. So this will be for Happy Wednesday and Thursday. It's Thursday. Let's do this. So the learning targets that we're focusing on are right here. So these two we've been focusing since we embarked on our journey into nonfiction. We've focused on these two learning targets right here. I can read and comprehend grade level literary nonfiction independently and proficiently. So you've been reading some nonfiction and you'll continue to do that. And I can determine the central idea of a text. So our first 2 days, that's kind of what we focused on, is determining that central idea. Or as we talked yesterday, another term that you might hear instead of central idea is main idea. They're interchangeable. They mean the exact same thing. Today, we're going to add a third learning target onto what we're already working on. And that is I can evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of presenting a topic or idea in different mediums. So authors of nonfiction, they have a lot of choices how they can present the information that they want to share with their audience. So we are going to take a look at a wide variety of mediums. Today we're going to take a look at picture books. We'll also be looking at short documentaries, infographics, podcasts, and interactive articles. Now, oftentimes when people think of nonfiction, they think of really thick, dense texts that have graphs and charts and numbers and just a bunch of information, like a textbook or a book, like a how-to book like this. But nonfiction really is a huge, wide body of work. And an author has to make the decision, how are they going to present the information that they have, the ideas that they have, in a way that is compelling to their readers? Who is their audience, and how are they going to present this information to their audience? So before today, we were taking a look at excerpts from the nonfiction book Hidden Figures, and that was in the form of a novel, and we just read some excerpts from that novel. If you want to continue, if you're interested and you like what you're reading, you can definitely continue reading. So if you go take advantage of those all 30 days that we have free of this Scribed account. There's two different options. If you search Hidden Figures, the first one that will come up is the adult version. And this was the first one that was released. So when Margot wrote the book originally, she wrote it for adults. Now, what happens oftentimes is that the books are wildly popular and the information is super interesting. And publishers and authors think, I bet you younger readers would really enjoy this book as well. Why don't we make an adaptation for younger readers? And what that really means is they go back through the book and they take out all the, I don't want to say boring, but the really minute details that make the book longer. And sometimes, when you're reading and you get into the really deep details and you're just like, come on, I want to know the gist of the story. That's kind of what they do for the young readers edition. They take out all the minor details and just leave in all the really interesting parts. So sometimes Mrs. Ash prefers to read the young readers edition. So both are available if you want all of the juicy details that the author originally put into the book. You can read this version. If you want to read the adapted version for younger readers, like middle school students, that is available to you here. So oftentimes nonfiction writers will put it in the form of a novel because maybe they have a lot to say about a certain topic, and that's how they are going to get that information out to the readers. But sometimes what we're going to look at today is picture books. Sometimes the author decides, I have this really important information and I want to put it into the form of a picture book. So picture books aren't just for, I've told you this many, 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 many times, picture books aren't just for, kindergartners, first graders, maybe second graders before you start reading chapter books. Picture books are for everybody. And we'll take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of each medium. And as you read, think about the advantages. Why would an author want to do all of this research, maybe years of research, and make it into a form of a picture book. So think about what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages of this medium, this as we read. So Mrs. Ash did the read aloud. That was the first thing that you were supposed to do today, is listen to the read aloud for Enough by Emily Easton. The next part that you're going to do is you're going to pick another nonfiction picture book. Now, many of you might have some nonfiction picture books at home that you want to use for this lesson, and that is totally fine. There's many of us, like myself included, I had to go all the way to school to pick this up a couple weeks ago because I knew I wanted to use it for this lesson. But many of us don't have the nonfiction picture books at home. I have this whole library behind me, but I don't have any nonfiction picture books on there. So you might not have any at home as well, and that's totally fine. This author right here, Brad Meltzer, he has a whole series on YouTube. When you see his books, when you look at his videos, they'll probably be familiar to you. But he has this whole I Am series, and they're nonfiction biographies about famous people in history. So if you don't have a nonfiction picture book at home, you can choose one of these. Feel free to watch them all, but you only have to choose one. So decide, do you want to learn about Neil Armstrong? Do you want to learn about Rosa Parks? Do you want to learn about Amelia Earhart? Or do you want to learn about Billie Jean King? When I read Enough, there was a lot of people that I had no idea what their contributions to our U.S. history were. So think about who you would like to learn a little bit more about, and then have the author, Brad Meltzer, read it aloud to you. After you're finished with the read aloud, or if you have a book at home that you're reading, what you're going to do is today's writing assignment. So your writing assignment looks like this. All of you have a copy of this in your Google Classroom. So just feel free to type right on the document and then turn it in your Google Classroom. So our learning targets are at the top. And the first thing that I want you to do is write the title and the author of your picture book that you read. So the one that Mrs. Ash is modeling, so don't do this one. This is the one I'm modeling for you. The one I'm modeling for you is Enough by Emily Easton. And the first task says, look for notable quotes or details from the picture book. So one of the advantages of using the medium of picture books is that you get to have an illustrator illustrate the book for you and put in all kinds of details into the artwork. So you can look at the artwork in the picture book that you read, or look at, oftentimes there's always quotes in nonfiction. What was interesting that came from the mouths of the famous people that you are reading about? So that's what Mrs. Ash did here to model it for you. So the first quote that I picked is, to those of you who think I have lost too much, I have gained everything. I have peace of heart, peace, like peace, not peace is like a puzzle piece or a little tiny piece. I have peace of heart, I have a clear conscience, and I am proud. Now, what I really loved about this picture book, I told you, is that it had a really beautiful, simple story with some really amazing illustrations. But then at the end, it went into more detail about each of the protesters that were featured. And there's lots of quotes from the protesters that were featured. So I picked some of those. So I like the one from Muhammad Ali because he is one of my very favorite protesters in history. And if you know anything about Muhammad Ali, he was in the prime of his boxing career. He was the champion, and he gave that all up because he did not want to go fight in the Vietnam War. He had many different reasons for not wanting to go fight in the Vietnam War. And one of the main reasons is that he didn't, as a Black person in the United States, he did not feel like he was treated fairly, like an equal citizen, and he didn't think it was fair that he was going to ask to give his life for a country that turned its back on him and wouldn't support him fully as a human person. So he really sacrificed a big part of his career. He lost his boxing license. He wasn't able to box in the United States. Eventually, it was restored, but a lot of people think, wow, you gave up your whole career. You were the most promising boxer during this time. And he said he was happy to do so because he had peace in his heart and a free conscience, and that he felt proud of that. So that's one of the reasons why I picked that quote. And then on the same note, Colin Kaepernick, who is more recently in the media, I picked his quote, which said, "I am not looking for approval. I have to stand up for people that are oppressed." And very similar to Muhammad Ali, Colin Kaepernick lost his football career in the prime of his athletic youth. Our bodies wear out after we only have a certain window of time. Those professional athletes, their bodies get older and worn out. And Colin Kaepernick was in his prime and he lost his football contract. So really similar to Muhammad Ali. And people really, it was such a controversy at the time. But I hope that people can see now, hindsight is 2020, looking back. I mean, still today with Muhammad Arbery just being killed recently, that's exactly what Colin Kaepernick is talking about and protesting. He wants to call more attention to that. So a lot of people think that it was a disservice, that Colin was treated unfairly for his protest. So that was it. I thought these quotes were super interesting, and I thought they kind of fit together. The last quote that I picked came from Ryan Deitch, and he was the one that wrote the beginning, the foreword. He was the cousin of the author that happened to be at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School when the mass shooting took place there. And his quote right at the end said, "Everyone's voices matter, and we want to help educate people and inspire them to speak up for what matters." And the reason that I picked that quote goes back to the end of my read aloud video when I asked you to think about what's problematic about this picture book. It's really beautiful and it has really important protesters from US history. And I thought I picked this quote because it says, "Everyone's voices matter," yet there was not one First Nations voice. There was not one United States tribe that was represented in this book. And there have been so many First Nations protesters that have done so much work. Just recently, the No Dapple protesters. Just recently, our own ICS students who protested and made a change for Indigenous Peoples Day. Not one. So that made me really upset. And then to read this quote, "Everyone's voice matters." Really, it does, because our voices were not included in this book here. So that's why I included that quote there. And we're going to get to that a little bit later. We're going to address that problem as our writers ourselves a little bit further into our nonfiction unit. So the last thing, a detail from the book that I noticed that I want to add here is that the illustrations are so beautiful. And here's one detail that I noticed here on Ruby Bridges' page. And I'm going to add this to my, this tomato that was thrown at her as this little beautiful young lady. All she's trying to do is go to school, and people treated her really rotten. And I thought the illustrators of picture books, of nonfiction, can include these small details that really make a big difference. The other thing that I noticed, so that's something as we have to do as readers of nonfiction picture books, is we have to pay attention to those illustrations and those small details. I really love this small detail. If you look in the background of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas protest, in the background, you can see the memorial that was set up after all of those young people were killed There was a huge memorial where people brought flowers and wrote poems and left, different trinkets or meaningful things just to honor the people that lost their lives that day. And I noticed that small detail there too. So that's the first thing that you'll do right here. Think about the picture book that you have read, whether it's one from home or one of the videos you watched. And what are some notable quotes or details from your picture book? And you'll list them here. The next thing you're going to ask yourself is, what surprised you, or what questions or comments did you have while listening or reading? Saying, I didn't have any questions is not an option. Good readers think while they are reading, and you are all amazing readers, so you should have some questions. So some questions that Mrs. Ash had while I was reading were, why in the heck weren't any First Nations voices included in the book? That was a question that I had. But I also had some questions of some of the protests as well. I wasn't sure who Jazz was, and why wearing a dress was so important. And then really one comment that I had about this one, Yoko Ono and John Lennon, they stayed in bed and that was their protest. And that was also just like Muhammad Ali, that was also during the Vietnam War. And I was like, well, you stayed in bed? I'm going to stay in bed. So they stayed in bed for 12 days to protest the Vietnam War. So I had some questions about that. And then I read the little blurb in the back about that. And it just said that they were protesting the Vietnam War and they just used their celebrity. They were it's the Beatles. John Lennon is from the Beatles and his wife Yoko Ono was an artist in her own right. But they were super famous. So they used their celebrity to call attention. And they would have people video them for these 12 days. And they talked for like 12 hours a day about peace and that sort of thing. So that was their protest, staying in bed. And my comment is, only a famous person could do that. If a regular person like you or I stayed in bed for 12 days, we probably would not, it wouldn't be an effective form of protest. So you have to have a certain status in order to do some of these protests that they have. So those were my two comments for this part of the section. Now so remember, this is a Wednesday and a Thursday assignment. So if you feel like, okay, I've had enough for that, put this aside and come back to it the next day. There's a few questions you'll answer down here. Write a brief summary of the picture book. So a brief summary, clear, concise. If I were to write a brief summary about enough that I always like to put it in a different color so I can see that it's different from the questions. And I like to use this Indie Flower font because it makes it seem like handwriting. So my summary might start out, in the book Enough by Emily Easton. Easton takes us, maybe not, introduces, I like that word better, introduces the reader to protesters from the protesters that in the book Enough by Emily Easton, Easton introduces the reader to protesters that changed and shaped, that sounds good, shaped American. She starts with Samuel Adams and his Tea Party protest in 1773 and ends with the young protesters from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas in 2018. Yes, 2018. Her simple picture book is followed up by a more detailed blurb about each BLURB, each protester featured. Okay, so let's see. Does that kind of sum up the whole book? A brief summary in the book Enough by Emily Easton. Easton introduces the reader to protesters that shaped American history. She starts with Samuel Adams and his Tea Party protest in 1773 and ends with the young protesters from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas in 2018. Her simple picture book is followed up by a more detailed blurb about each protester featured. Good. I think that sums up what the book is about. Don't forget, when you have a title of a book, you always italicize it. So that's proper punctuation, italicize the book. Now, the next thing you're going to do, you're going to ask yourself, what is the central idea of this picture book? So what is the point that Emily Easton is trying to get across to her reader through this book? So if I were to sum that up in one sentence, I might say that protesters from all walks of life, young, old, male, female, all kinds of sexual orientations, can change the world. They can change history. So I think that is a central idea of this picture book. And the next question, I bet you can guess. Yep, it has to do with themes. What themes have you noticed emerge from this book? So definitely I would think about motifs such as racism and sexism and violence and let's see what else. What else as I look through motifs? Immigrant rights. All of those are some motifs. So one theme that I see emerge from this book is, in order to change the world, sometimes you have to sacrifice something that you love, whether it be your time, whether it be your career, like Muhammad Ali and Colin Kaepernick. So that's definitely a theme in the book. Sometimes you have to make some sacrifices to make changes for the better of the greater good of people in our world. That would be the theme that I see emerge the most. And the last question, what connections can you make between this picture book and your own life experience? Why? Does this picture book remind you of anything else you've read or seen? If so, how and why? So the connection that I make, definitely, I'm a teacher, so I can connect with these students and school violence. I might jot a few sentences about that done. That's one connection that I have. The second connection that I have is that I don't see a lot of First Nations people represented in this book. So that's my connection, that I would have liked to see First Nations people in this book. There's a lot of First Nations protesters that I am familiar with. All of the people in the No DAPL movement most recently, which was very, very, very important. for our environment, for our tribal sovereignty, and all of those rights that we have as First Nations people. So that's another connection that I have. And this picture book reminds me of, let's see, the No Dapple protests that I've seen. So once you're finished with this, remember to turn it into your Google Classroom, and please email me if you have any questions or concerns. I know this was one of our longest lessons yet, so if it takes you 2 days to finish it, that is okay. If you have questions while you're reading, please email me. And I hope that you are enjoying this unit so far, and I hope that you learned something new. The last part of your assignment is to share one fact that you learned from your nonfiction reading today with someone at home. So I'm going to go off and share something with my daughter Sierra that I learned about some of the Native American protesters, and I will see you soon. I miss you. Bye.